The barn door resisted with the obstinacy of wood, swollen by moisture and locked fast by ice. Louisa Hartman threw her weight against the weathered planks until the iron hinges surrendered with a shriek, and snow tumbled inward, not falling, but driven each flake a tiny blade against exposed skin. The blizzard had been carving its way across the Wyoming Territory since midnight on Christmas Eve, reshaping the landscape into something unrecognizable. What had been fence posts now wore white crowns taller than a man. The wagon road to Bitter Creek existed only as memory beneath drifts that climbed halfway to the barn's sagging roofline. Christmas morning arrived without Charity bringing wind that spoke in howls and cold that could stop a heart. She expected frozen buckets, their surfaces glazed thick. She expected Hans and Greta stamping in their stalls, breath clouding. What stopped her just inside the threshold lantern, swinging from numb fingers and throwing wild shadows, was the man. He sat slumped against a hay bale head, canted at an angle suggesting either unconsciousness or its permanent cousin. Fringed buckskins clung to his frame, torn in places and blackened with blood that had soaked through not fresh red, but the dark rust of hours passing. An eagle feather war bonnet hung askew white plumes crusted with ice that caught the lantern light and fractured it into small cold stars. Melted snow had run from his shoulders, in rivulets pooling beneath him. A crimson trail marked his path across the barn floor, every few feet another smear where he had collapsed, then somehow clawed forward again toward a safety that might not exist. In his arms, wrapped in a blanket gone gray with use, a baby screamed with the fury of one who has learned the world offers no quarter. The sound cut through the wind's howl, the infant's chest hitched with each breath, small fists flailing. The warrior's arms remained locked around the child, even in semi-consciousness, protective, in the way bones protect hearts. For one heartbeat, Louisa thought only of danger. She thought of the men in Bitter Creek, who said homesteads sheltering hostiles deserved fire, that any woman fool enough to offer aid deserved whatever followed. She thought of Caleb Rusk and his regulators, who settled accounts with rifle butts and rope. She thought of the mercantile whispers about Lakota raids and how decent folk ought to handle savages who strayed too near civilization's edge. Then the baby's cry broke on a wheeze that sounded like drowning on dry land, and the warrior's eyes opened. They fixed on her dark, steady despite agony that must have been singing through him like wire drawn too tight. He did not speak, did not reach for the knife at his belt or the carbine just beyond reach in blood-stained straw. He only looked at her, and in that look lived a question older than language. The air in the barn carried a smell that would haunt her old blood, mixed with the mineral scent of snow, and beneath that, something sharper, the acrid bite of infection beginning its work. When the warrior shifted slightly, the sound that escaped through clenched teeth was not quite human more. The hiss of steam escaping from something under unbearable pressure. Louisa dropped to her knees in straw that crackled with frost. "Give him to me." The warrior hesitated, his arms locked tighter, every instinct resisting. Then, with visible cost, he forced his fingers to uncurl. As he passed the child toward her, the movement tore open the wound in his thigh. Fresh blood welled up bright, almost luminous, against the dark pool already staining the straw. It spread with terrible patience, and Louisa could smell it now, copper and salt, and something else, something like metal left too long in rain. Outside, beyond barn walls, and the curtain of driving snow, a horse snorted. Another answered from a different direction nearer. Someone had been hunting this man through the blizzard, and they had not abandoned the trail. Louisa pulled the baby against her chest and felt his heartbeat hammering like something trying to break free. The warrior's head sagged forward. His breathing had gone shallow, each inhalation a visible labor. She had seconds to decide what manner of woman she would prove herself to be. She made her choice. Louisa Hartman was 28, a German immigrant who had arrived in Wyoming Territory 5 years prior, as Christian Hartman's bride. Christian had been a bookkeeper for the Blackwater Falls silver mine, methodical, quiet, possessed of handwriting that never wavered and numbers that balanced to the penny. He had promised her a house security, a future distant from the New York tenements where she had scrubbed floors and mended clothing for coins that bought survival and nothing more. The house he delivered stood at Bitter Creek's edge, a structure of weathered boards and a roof that leaked when rains came hard. The barn tilted where foundation had settled unevenly into clay. The horses Hans and Greta were perhaps the worthiest inheritance. Security and future had died with Christian 4 months earlier in what the foreman called a shaft collapse. They brought him back wrapped in canvas, stiff with dried blood. The foreman pressed $20 into her hand with a look that forbade questions. The mine sent nothing more. House barn horses, a vegetable patch, barely sufficient, these were hers to manage or lose. She survived teaching school twice weekly, where miners' and homesteaders' children traced letters on slates. She sold milk and eggs along the main street when surplus allowed walking past false front buildings and the Ruskin Company assay shack with head properly lowered. The town was not unkind, merely indifferent. Widows were common as graves. Sympathy cost nothing and lasted exactly that long. Bitter Creek sat near Lakota hunting grounds, though the Lakota kept mostly to hills and cottonwood riverbanks upstream. Real power belonged to Caleb Rusk, former irregular captain, who now ran the mine through money fear, and men like Jackrabbit Jim, who collected debts with an efficiency measured in bruises. Sheriff Hewitt wore the badge, kept peace by looking away when Rusk's business drew blood. The only man who crossed that invisible line was Dr. Valentine Moore, a scarred Civil War surgeon who treated anyone, regardless of coin or skin. He owed his life to a Lakota scout who had dragged him from a battlefield when Confederate lead had torn through his ribs. The scar remained a thick ridge he rubbed when cold made it speak. 3 days before Christmas, Louisa's wagon nearly tipped into the Wind River when ice broke with a sound like a rifle shot. She and Farmer McCrae, muddy boots to the school children, levered it back with a fence post, while current clawed the ice edge and spray froze on their sleeves. A stark lesson winter forgave nothing. What Louisa did not know, kneeling in blood-soaked straw with a screaming baby and a dying warrior, was that another storm had already broken. One planned at Christian's desk by candlelight, recorded in his neat hand, set in motion by men who measured profit in silver veins and land deeds, and cared nothing for lives caught between. In the weeks before his death, Christian had seemed troubled. He stayed late at his desk pen, scratching at ledgers he tucked away when she entered. Once she asked if something weighed on him. He smiled that distant way and told her not to concern herself with business matters. She had trusted her quiet, methodical husband. Now kneeling in straw that reeked of blood and worse, she wondered what secrets Christian had carried to an unmarked grave. Somewhere in the attic, she remembered there was a box of his papers. She had not yet opened letters and accounts she had lacked the heart to sort. She recalled seeing one page slip from a pile covered in his distinctive script with its characteristic backward slant on the capital letters. But grief had made her careless then. Now that memory returned with the weight of premonition. The wound in the warrior's thigh was no clean hole, but a vicious channel carved through muscle missing artery and bone by what could only be called grace or accident. The flesh surrounding it had gone rigid hot to touch. Fever burned beneath grime and dried blood on his face. She could feel it radiating from him like a stove not quite banked. If she left him, he would die before nightfall. If she kept him and Rusk's men found him, they would all die. She made the only choice that felt remotely right, though she knew it for foolishness. She wrapped the baby in her mother's wool shawl and tucked him in a hay-lined crate. She hid the warrior behind stacked bales where shadows lay thickest. Then she saddled Hans and rode into the storm. The road to Bitter Creek was a pale scar under drifting white. Twice she lost it, followed instead the sound of the wind river ice groaning beneath the surface, like something in pain. Near the telegraph line, she nearly collided with 3 riders coming from the opposite direction. Faces wrapped in scarves, crusted with frost, that had gone beyond white to a kind of blue-gray, like the color of corpses. Jackrabbit Jim reined close enough she could see his eyes pale as creek ice just as cold. "Storm'll chew you up, schoolmarm," he called over the wind. "Rusk says a Lakota savage shot one of ours last night. You seen tracks." Louisa kept her voice level as a drawn line. "The only tracks that concern me run between my barn and well. I need Dr. Moore or I'll lose a horse." Jim studied her, the empty sled, the fresh runner marks leading from her homestead. Suspicion hung between them, dense as fog. Then he touched his hat brim and let her pass, but his gaze followed her until the storm swallowed her outline. Valentine climbed onto the sled 10 minutes later. Medical bag lashed, tight collar turned against wind that seemed less weather than malice. He waited until they were a mile out before speaking. "Who's hurt?" "A man. Gunshot. Fever." His jaw tightened visibly. "White or Lakota? Does it matter to a physician?" He looked at her a long moment, then shook his head. "No, but it'll matter to everyone else. Always does in this God-forsaken territory." There was something in his voice, not quite bitterness, but a weariness that came from watching men bleed the same red and die the same death, only to have the living draw lines over their graves. On the return journey, a fallen cottonwood blocked the trail. They hacked at frozen branches for 20 minutes, fingers going numb despite gloves. By the time they cleared space for the sled, Louisa's hands bled from splinters, and her face felt like leather left too long in sun. Inside the barn, Valentine cut away buckskin and examined the wound by lantern light. The rifle ball had carved through meat, but missed bone, miraculous or unfortunate depending on perspective. He cleaned it with boiled water, threaded a curved needle with silk, began stitching with the efficiency of a man who had sewn battlefield wounds while artillery spoke overhead. Halfway through, the warrior's hand shot out and clamped Louisa's wrist. Not a grip, but a vice desperate blind. She did not pull away, held the lantern steady, and watched Valentine work. When the last stitch was tied, the warrior's fingers slowly uncurled, leaving a bracelet of bruises in purple and yellow that she would touch absently for days after, as if the pain were something she needed to remember. The storm buried them for 6 days, turning the world into endless white and gray, where horizon ceased to exist. Louisa's homestead became an island. Inside days took on a suspended rhythm. The warrior's name was Ohiteka, he stands brave, in Valentine's rough translation. Perhaps 25, though pain and fever made age uncertain. His sister had been Istas Running Doe, known for beadwork and quick laughter. The baby was her only surviving child, born last autumn when leaves turned gold. Ohiteka told them this in halting English, supplemented with signs, sitting on a stool near the stove, with his wounded leg stretched straight. He could not stand without a crutch, but insisted on working. He mended harness with stitches neater than anything Louisa could manage. Sharpened tools on the whetstone with rhythmic strokes that produced a sound oddly soothing, metal on stone, a conversation in sparks. He showed Louisa how to bind the baby with cloth bands in a pattern that calmed the child's breathing. The technique was remarkably effective, and she found herself watching his hands, noting the precision and the unexpected gentleness in fingers scarred from bow and blade. They traded language from necessity and something like curiosity. Louisa wrote English words in charcoal on scrap boards: hay, river, rifle, while Ohiteka murmured Lakota equivalents in a voice growing stronger daily. When he stumbled over letters, she steadied his hand on the board thumb resting along his knuckles. It was practical necessary. But both felt the jolt of awareness in how carefully they avoided eyes afterward, how her hand lingered, perhaps a heartbeat past requirement. Valentine moved between barn and house-changing dressings twice daily and sharing quiet news. Lakota survivors from the Owl Canyon camp had gathered in a hidden ravine upstream, sheltering in makeshift lodges, counting dead by firelight. Hewitt had warned Rusk another raid would bring federal investigators, but Rusk only laughed. There were rumors, Valentine said quietly, of rich silver under the Owl Canyon bluffs, and Rusk wanted the land cleared before spring brought surveyors. One bitter afternoon, when wind screamed against the walls like something trying to get in, the baby spiked sudden fever. His forehead burned hot enough to frighten her, his breathing rapid and shallow. She and Ohiteka worked together without discussion, moving around each other with efficiency born of shared desperation. He showed her how to steep willow bark. For fever tea, she measured dose on her brass balance. They bathed the child together, passing him hand to hand over a wooden tub. And when his fever broke near midnight, with both of them swaying from exhaustion, Louisa's knees nearly gave out. Ohiteka caught her elbow before she fell grip warm through her sleeve. His palm was heavily calloused, the hand of a man who had worked weapons and horses his whole life. Neither spoke. The moment stretched fragile and waited. Then he released her and turned back to the baby with movements slightly more deliberate than necessary. Outside wind continued its assault. Inside, in the warm circle of lantern light and stove heat, something like trust was being built slowly in the spaces between words and careful touches. Later that night, unable to sleep, Louisa climbed into the attic with her lamp. She had been thinking of that box of Christian's papers. When she found it, dust lay thick on the lid. Inside were ledgers, correspondence, and beneath them a single page she recognized by the distinctive backward slant of the capital letters. It was not a full account, merely what looked like a draft or note to himself. Rusk's plan requires false attribution. I cannot. The rest was crossed out, but she could make out beneath the scribbling the child must not. And then what might have been fine, the star pattern. She folded it carefully and returned it to the box, her hands trembling slightly. It meant nothing yet. But it felt like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples not yet visible, but inevitable. On the 7th morning after Christmas, when the blizzard had exhausted itself and left behind a landscape of painful brightness under crystalline blue, Louisa climbed into the attic properly this time. She was looking for money, overlooked debts to collect some windfall to carry her through winter. The attic was cramped and bitter cold, her breath emerging in thick clouds. What she found was a small packet wrapped in oilcloth, wedged behind a roof beam, where it would be invisible unless sought. The packet was secured with twine, no label. When she opened it, she found pages in Christian's hand. The heading read, "Private Account, Owl Canyon Operations." Not for general mine ledger. Destroy after resolution. Her hands began to shake as she read. The cold in the attic seemed to intensify, seeping into her bones, not from without, but from within, as if the words themselves carried winter inside them. Columns listed rifles, blankets, whiskey, what Christian termed Army hospitality expenditures. Cash payments to special riders, recorded only as initials. In the margin beside, proposed night operation winter camp clearance. Christian had written, Rusk proposes false raid, attributed to Lakota hostiles. Such attribution will justify federal protection of mine holdings and facilitate removal of impediment to canyon access. Investors in St. Louis notified await timeline confirmation. But the note scrawled at the bottom of the second page, in a hand far less controlled than Christian's usual precision, sent genuine horror through her. Cannot proceed as planned. The infant survived. Rusk demands I arrange placement with Assimilation School St. Louis, or eliminate the problem permanently. I cannot. I will not. Have hidden child with tradesman family upriver. Will retrieve when suspicion passes. If I do not survive this task, may God forgive my part in this evil. The cradle board has 5 pointed star pattern, white and blue beads, 3 small stars within each point. Only one like it. Find the child. Protect the child. C.H. Louisa read it 3 times, hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. The baby downstairs was not random casualty, but living witness to planned atrocity, and Christian had died trying to save him. Her husband had not been willing architect of massacre, but murdered for his refusal. The realization struck with physical force, reshaping everything she thought she knew. That evening after dark, she brought the ledger to the barn and spread the pages on the workbench under 2 lanterns, throat tight and stomach churning with grief and rage, and something near shame for having doubted Christian's decency. Valentine read first his weathered face, going progressively pale and hard. When he finished, he set the papers down with exaggerated care, then swore under his breath in language learned on battlefields. "Well," he said finally, voice dry as bone, "there's your Christian jurisprudence. Murder a few dozen people, blame the survivors, make sure the paperwork balances. Civilization marches on." The bitterness in his words was not loud but deep, like water cutting through rock. He handed the ledger to Ohiteka without speaking. Ohiteka read slowly, lips moving slightly, finger tracing each word. When he reached the line describing beaded cradleboard 5-pointed star pattern with white and blue beads, 3 small stars within each point to be catalogued as physical evidence, he went absolutely still. His finger tapped the page once, twice, confirming what his eyes saw. He looked up at Louisa with eyes that had gone flat and unreadable. The tentative warmth between them seemed to drain away, like water into sand. "This pattern." His voice was stripped of all inflection, mechanical. "My sister made this. I helped. 2 winters passed. White star, blue, and white beads from Pierre's fort. 5 points, 3 small stars in each. I cut the frame, bent it in steam 3 days. No other pattern like this in all the camps." He paused, and in that pause lived something Louisa could not name. "This is my sister's work. This is my sister's son." The silence that followed pressed down like physical weight. Louisa wanted to explain, to make him understand she had not known that Christian kept his involvement hidden. But words stuck because the truth was simpler and more brutal. She had been married to a man involved, however reluctantly, in planning the massacre that killed his sister and orphaned this child. No ignorance could absolve that connection. Valentine broke the crushing quiet voice, rough. "This ledger reaches the wrong hands, Army or Rusk's people, they bury it, and everyone who's seen it. Reaches the right hands, Eastern investors might take action to avoid scandal. But keeping it here is suicide." Ohiteka set the ledger down with exaggerated care. He stared at the barn door, measuring distances, calculating odds. For the first time since arriving, bleeding on Christmas morning, Louisa saw him consider whether he could make it out alone with the baby, on one damaged leg, through hostile country. "I need time to think," he said finally, voice distant. Then he turned away and limped toward the barn's rear. Louisa watched him go and felt something crack inside her chest, a fracture in something she had not realized she was building until she felt it begin to break. In that moment, she wanted to tell him about her own fear and the terror that had seized her when she first saw his blood spreading in the straw, how she had nearly vomited from the copper salt smell of it, how some weak part of her had wanted to simply close the barn door and walk away. She wanted to confess that she was not brave, that Christian's careful script on those pages made her feel complicit by marriage alone, that she did not know if she was strong enough for what lay ahead. But the words would not come. so she simply stood there, holding the ledger that had become both evidence and indictment, and said nothing at all. In Bitter Creek, in the Broken Wheel's overheated back room where a pot-bellied stove glowed red and imported whiskey sat half empty, Jackrabbit Jim found Rusk nursing his third drink and staring at a crude territory map. Jim told him about sled tracks from the Hartman place during the worst blizzard anyone could remember, about the schoolteacher stubborn or foolish enough to ride, when sense would dictate staying home. Rusk remembered Christian's widow well. Remembered how Christian once bragged over drinks about his systematic record-keeping, his habit of maintaining duplicate records in case originals were lost to fire. If any copy of that ledger existed beyond the one Rusk had personally burned, page by page in his office stove, it would be hidden in that weathered house tucked away by Christian's methodical German habits. He sent word to Hewitt next morning that he intended a lawful search for stolen mine property on the Hartman homestead. The pretext was transparently thin, but Rusk made clear that if Hewitt refused certain information about the sheriff's unauthorized medical visits to Lakota, patients might reach the ears of drunk, angry miners. Hewitt, neither stupid nor suicidal, chose the lesser evil. He rode out ahead of Rusk at dawn with 2 nervous deputies, under a sky the color of old iron jaw clenched and hand resting on his revolver. At the barn, he found what his cynical side expected a Lakota warrior on a stool with crutch nearby. Louisa standing close enough to shield him with her skirts. The baby asleep in a crate. Valentine wrapping a fresh bandage around a healing bullet wound. Hewitt's hand rested on his holster 5 dangerous seconds, while scenarios played out: arrest, violence, investigators, trials, hangings. Then he deliberately turned and bellowed to the deputies that the barn was clear, just lame horses and junk. While they trudged back to search the house slowly and incompetently, Hewitt stepped closer and spoke low. "You're harboring trouble that'll hang you, Mrs. Hartman. Rusk is coming with half his men. He wants 2 things: that Indian dead and whatever papers your husband left. Court won't help because he owns the judge. Army won't help because they're complicit. But there's an old ventilation shaft from Blackwater Falls running north under your back pasture. Comes out in timber 2 miles from here. If you're set on this path, you've got tonight. After dawn, I have to pretend I saw what Rusk tells me. Understand?" He left with a slammed door and stone face. They now had hours instead of days. The argument that followed was tense, conducted in urgent whispers with frequent glances toward the door. Ohiteka suggested drawing Rusk's men away so Louisa and Valentine could escape with the child. Louisa flatly refused to trade one life for another voice, shaking with barely suppressed emotion. Valentine offered to stay as decoy and face Rusk alone. Louisa reminded him brutally that Bitter Creek needed a doctor and his death would serve no one. After nearly an hour of desperate debate, they settled on the only plan offering even a sliver of survival move together: through the mine shaft, carrying ledger and child prey. The storm's aftermath would cover tracks long enough to reach the Lakota camp, where numbers might mean safety. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan they had. Before dawn on the 8th day after Christmas, with bitter wind driving ice needles sideways, Rusk's riders surrounded the homestead. Lanterns bobbed like malevolent stars, rifles ready faces, rapt intentions unmistakable. Louisa Hartman. Rusk's voice carried clearly amplified by rage and certainty of power. "You've got something of mine. Bring out the Indian and any papers your husband left, or I burn you out and take your place apart board by board." A rifle shot punctuated his demand, the ball smashing the kitchen window, showering glass. Another punched through the barn wall, spitting splinters near Hans's head and making the draft horse rear. Inside, Valentine fired measured shots through gaps in the boards, aiming at horses' legs and ground near riders rather than men. Trying to slow them, create chaos, not kill, not yet. Ohiteka positioned where he could cover well and porch carbine resting on a hay bale because his wounded leg would not support prolonged standing. Each recoil threatened to buckle the damaged muscle, sending pain jolting up through hip and spine. Louisa knelt at the rear wall, sawing frantically through a frozen hinge until metal screamed and her shoulders burned. The baby whimpered with each shot. She kept one hand pressed over his tiny ears, trying to muffle the terrifying noise. When two of Rusk's men came forward, carrying a crate clearly holding dynamite, Ohiteka made his decision. He looked at Louisa one long moment, dark eyes unreadable, then spoke in a voice flat and final. "I draw them away. You take the child through the shaft. Only way." Before anyone could argue, he shoved upright with a grunt, grabbed carbine and crutch, limped out the front directly into Storm and guns. He moved with the deliberate gait of wounded prey, making himself an obvious target. He fired twice as he emerged, both shots carefully aimed to wound, and the effect was immediate. 3 riders wheeled after him with triumphant shouts, pursuing what looked like easy prey and leaving the rear temporarily unguarded. Louisa felt something tear in her chest, watching him disappear into pre-dawn darkness, bullets kicking up snow around his limping figure. But she did not freeze, forced herself to move, shoving the baby into Valentine's arms and yanking the partially sawed door open with desperate strength. They slipped through into howling wind and blinding snow. Using the barn's bulk as cover, Louisa led them in a stumbling run toward the rise, hiding the shaft entrance. Snow was not as deep as during the worst blizzard, but still treacherous, hiding uneven ground. Twice, Valentine went down, clutching the baby protectively. Twice, Louisa hauled him upright and kept them moving. On the far side of the pasture, dimly audible through wind, she heard gunfire, single-shot pause, 2 more rapid. Ohiteka's pattern. She could not tell if he still lived or if those were his last shots. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but the baby's warmth and Valentine's harsh breathing kept her focused reach the shaft. Near the entrance, concealed beneath drifted snow and skeletal brush ground, gave way under Louisa's foot. She dropped to one knee with a cry boot punching through thin crust into empty air and pitched forward. Momentum carried her toward what she now realized was a sinkhole above the old tunnel, partially collapsed and invisible under fresh snow. For one terrible heartbeat, she was falling center of gravity, tipping past recovery darkness, below yawning like a mouth. Then rope settled around her upper arm with impossible precision, woven hemp loop tightening above her elbow, and she was yanked backward so hard her shoulder nearly dislocated. She hit snow-flat impact, driving air from lungs in an explosive gasp, and looked up to see Ohiteka braced against a frost-covered post. Both hands locked on rope-wounded leg, shaking violently with strain, but somehow impossibly holding. "Move," he gasped when Valentine helped her up, breath coming in torn clouds. They are coming. He had come back. Through gunfire and pain and real possibility of death, he circled back rather than leave her to fall. That choice, made without hesitation, struck Louisa harder than any words could. They reached the shaft together, Louisa, Valentine, Ohiteka baby, and descended the iron-rung ladder into cold, absolute darkness. Valentine went first, with lantern clenched in teeth and baby secured inside his coat. Then Louisa, finally Ohiteka, coming down one agonizing rung at a time, wounded leg refusing to bend and forcing him to lower himself with arm strength alone. The tunnel below was narrow, damp, lined with ancient timbers groaning under earth and stone above. They picked forward along old rail ties, trying for speed, but finding darkness and uneven footing nightmarishly difficult. Louisa carried the baby, now wrapped against her chest. Ohiteka leaned heavily on iron pipe, grabbed at the shaft top. Valentine led with lantern held high, swinging light casting wild shadows that made judging distances nearly impossible. Behind them, terrifyingly close voices echoed down the shaft. Rusk and at least 3 men had found the entrance, and were moving faster because unencumbered by wounds or infants. Faster, Valentine urged quietly, but there was nowhere faster. The tunnel was the tunnel, and they could only move as quickly as Ohiteka's damaged leg allowed. Gunfire cracked in the confined space, shockingly loud muzzle flash, bright enough to leave afterimages burned on vision. A bullet whined off stone near Louisa's head, showering her with stinging chips. Another splintered an ancient support, sending rotten wood cascading down. Valentine thrust his revolver into Louisa's free hand, face grim. "If they get close, you shoot. Shoot for his chest. Don't hesitate." She nodded, throat too tight for words, and cocked the hammer with a thumb that shook despite efforts to steady it. At a choke point where the roof sagged dangerously and ancient timbers buckled under decades of pressure, Ohiteka stopped. He turned to face back, his face pale and slick with sweat, but eyes calm and absolutely certain. He handed the ledger to Louisa, pressing it into her hands with deliberate care. "You take the child and papers. Go now. I hold them here as long as I can." His meaning was brutally clear. This was where he intended his stand, where he would die, buying them time. Louisa felt the world narrow to crystalline clarity. She could see the path forward, Valentine already moving with the lantern baby warm against her chest, escape perhaps only minutes away if they abandoned Ohiteka. She could also see the other path leading toward something she had not known she was capable of until this moment, without quite realizing what she was doing. Operating on instinct deeper than thought, she stepped beside Ohiteka instead of past him. Positioned herself shoulder to shoulder, raised the revolver, cocked the hammer with a sharp, definitive click. "Then we hold them together," she said, voice surprisingly steady. "I did not drag you from my barn to watch you die alone in darkness." His head turned sharply, surprise and something like hope flickering across his face. Before he could argue, Rusk's men rounded the bend lanterns, flaring like hellfire. Ohiteka fired first, carbine report deafening. The lead man's lantern exploded in burning oil and broken glass, plunging that section into chaos. Men shouted, cursed. In the confusion, Louisa aimed at the sagging ceiling beam above the pursuers, exactly as Valentine taught her. She squeezed the trigger, felt the revolver buck, watched ancient wood splinter. Rusk, 50 feet back and furious at being stalled by a woman and crippled Indian, made his fatal mistake. He pulled dynamite from his coat, lit the fuse from his lantern, hurled it down the tunnel with all his strength. The dynamite sailed through air in a lazy arc, fuse sputtering. It hit the floor, bounced once, rolled toward them with terrible momentum. Louisa had 3 seconds, 3 heartbeats, before blast would tear through and kill them all. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she felt it in her throat, in her temples, a frantic drumbeat, counting down the last moments of life. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps that tasted of rock dust and fear. Not the abstract concept of fear, but its physical manifestation, metallic and bitter on the back of her tongue like licking a knife blade. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously. Everything happening too fast to think, yet slow enough to see individual sparks falling from the dynamite fuse as it tumbled closer. She grabbed Ohiteka's arm and yanked him sideways toward a narrow side drift she had noticed little more than a shadowed gap in the wall that might lead nowhere or salvation. They stumbled through the opening, just as dynamite detonated with a sound that was less noise than physical force. A hammer blow of compressed air and sound that lifted them off their feet and slammed them into rough stone. Her lungs screamed for air, but found only dust so thick it was like trying to breathe cloth. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned all other sound. The baby, where was the baby? Panic clawed up her throat as she scrabbled blindly across loose rock in absolute darkness, the lantern extinguished. She heard the infant's thin wail somewhere to her left. felt Ohiteka moving beside her, both searching desperately. His hand found the baby first, scooping the child up an instant before a shower of rocks cascaded down, clattering across the exact spot where the infant had been. Pain exploded through Ohiteka's wounded leg as something heavy struck at timber or stone impossible to tell in darkness. And she heard him make a sound between gasp and strangled scream. Then his leg gave out entirely, and he collapsed, still clutching the baby protectively. But something else happened in that moment of collapse. A larger rock, perhaps the size of a man's head, came hurtling down directly toward Louisa's exposed back as she reached for the baby. Ohiteka saw it in the split second before his leg buckled, and instead of falling away from the danger, he twisted his body and took the impact across his shoulders. The stone hit with a sound like an axe biting into wood, a wet, meaty thud that made Louisa's stomach turn, even though she couldn't see it in the darkness. Ohiteka's breath left him in a rush, and she felt, rather than saw him curl around the baby, protecting the child, even as the rock tore through his buckskin shirt and opened a gash from shoulder blade to spine. Behind them, the main tunnel collapsed. Tons of rock and earth and shattered timber came down in a roaring avalanche that seemed eternal. The concussion wave ripped through the side drift dust, filling air so thickly it was impossible to breathe without choking. If Rusk and his men had not died instantly in the blast, they were certainly dead now, crushed or suffocated under the collapse. Sound of falling rock gradually diminished to occasional rattles, then to oppressive ringing quiet, broken only by their harsh breathing, fast, desperate gasps that burned in dust-filled lungs, and the baby's frightened crying. Roof timbers groaned above them, deep and ominous, suggesting the collapse was not finished. A crack appeared in the ceiling, visible even in near-total darkness, as a thin line of slightly lesser black. Dust and pebbles began sifting down through the widening gap. Small rocks clattered around them. "We have to move." Valentine's voice came from somewhere ahead, hoarse and shaking. "This whole section is coming down. Move now, or we die here." Louisa made the cruelest choice of her life. She could not carry Ohiteka, too heavy leg, too damaged tunnel, too treacherous. Could not leave the baby. Could barely carry herself. But she refused with every fiber of her being to leave him behind, to be buried alive in darkness. She jammed the ledger inside her coat, grabbed Ohiteka under both arms from behind, and began to drag him. Valentine appeared beside her lantern, somehow relit though the flame guttered weakly, and grabbed Ohiteka's other side. Together they hauled him backward through the side drift, moving inches at a time, while rocks continued raining down and timbers screamed overhead. The air itself seemed to have weight now, pressing down on her chest like invisible hands. Each breath felt like swallowing broken glass, sharp edges scraping throat and lungs raw. Her shoulders burned with effort until the pain became almost unbearable, muscles trembling with sustained strain. Her hip throbbed where a rock had struck it earlier, pain shooting down her entire leg with each movement and nearly buckling her knee. She could taste copper blood from where she had bitten through her lip without noticing. The baby wailed in Ohiteka's arms, and that thin sound was perhaps the only thing keeping them moving when exhaustion and despair threatened to stop them. The tunnel walls seemed to be closing in, or perhaps that was just her vision narrowing from lack of air and overwhelming terror. The darkness was not merely absence of light, but presence of something else, a weight, a pressure, a suffocating embrace that wanted to pull them down and hold them forever. Louisa had never understood the word, this kind of smothering fear. Until this moment had never known that fear could be so physical, so visceral, that it manifested as a crushing sensation in the chest and a desperate animal need to claw upward toward open sky. A boulder the size of a butter churn crashed down where they had been seconds before impact, sending up a choking cloud and making the floor shake. Another rock grazed Louisa's hip again, with brutal force, sending brilliant, white-hot pain lancing through her and very nearly buckling her knee completely. The world narrowed to burning muscles and desperate gasping breaths, and the continuous sound of timber splitting above, and the baby's cries driving her forward like a whip. They stumbled, crawled, dragged themselves through the side drift as it angled upward, floor becoming slope, then nearly a climb. Tree roots began appearing in walls, pale and exposed in weak lantern light, sign they were nearing surface. Valentine went first, clearing loose dirt and rocks, and suddenly there was daylight, weak and gray, but unmistakably real, filtering down through a gap. They pulled themselves up one at a time, Valentine first, then Louisa, passing the baby up, then both reaching down to haul Ohiteka through the hole. He came up into morning light with face gray, and leg bent at an angle obviously wrong, fresh blood soaking through bandages Valentine had so carefully applied days before. The new wound across his back had torn open further during the dragging, leaving a dark stain spreading across what remained of his shirt. Conscious, but barely, eyes glassy with pain and shock. They had emerged in heavy timber about 2 miles north of the homestead, surrounded by snow-covered pines and absolute hush following catastrophe. Behind and below earth had settled over the collapsed tunnel like a grave. Nothing would dig through that collapse for years, if ever. Caleb Rusk and his hired killers were gone, buried forever under tons of Wyoming Territory stone. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke, too stunned and exhausted to do more than breathe. Then Louisa looked down at Ohiteka, lying in the snow, his face the color of old parchment, his wounded leg twisted at that terrible angle, the new wound on his back still seeping, and felt her throat close with fear that after everything, the blizzard and bullets and collapsing mine, she might still lose him. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "You're back that rock. The child lives," Ohiteka said through teeth clenched against pain. "That is what matters." Then, after a pause during which his breath came in short, sharp gasps, "You stayed. In the tunnel. You could have run." "I was afraid." Louisa admitted the words coming before she could stop them. "I'm still afraid. I don't know if I'm strong enough for any of this. But I know I couldn't live with myself if I had left you there." She paused, then added more quietly, "Christian died trying to protect that baby. I won't fail where he succeeded." Something shifted in Ohiteka's eyes, the flatness receding slightly, replaced by something that might have been understanding. He did not speak, but his hand moved almost imperceptibly, fingers uncurling as if in invitation. Louisa took his hand and held it, and neither spoke again until they heard horses approaching through the trees. Sheriff Hewitt and Muddy Boots found them 3 hours later, following smoke from the burned barn and the echo of underground explosion that had shaken windows in Bitter Creek. Rusk's remaining riders, those who had not followed their boss into the shaft, scattered when the ground shook. Some would reappear weeks later in other towns under different names. Others simply vanished into the territories, unwilling to face questions about their involvement. Hewitt took one long look at the 4 survivors, the baby Ohiteka's shattered leg, and torn back the ledger in Louisa's hands, and made a decision that would define his career. He sent Muddy Boots back to town, with instructions to tell anyone who asked that Rusk and his men died in accidental mine collapse, while conducting authorized business, and that no blame attached to anyone else. It was a lie, but a lie that would save lives and perhaps bring some measure of justice. In a crude shelter near Owl Canyon, constructed from bent willows and salvaged canvas, Lakota survivors gathered around the 4 fugitives who stumbled into their camp. Women emerged from behind windbreaks, men from scouting positions. And then, moving slowly but unmistakably alive, Istas limped forward from shadows. Half her long black hair had been burned away, leaving one side nearly bare and badly scarred. Ribs bound with tanned hide, she moved with careful stiffness of someone nursing broken bones. She had not died under that fallen lodge. Other women had dragged her out barely alive with a bullet wound in her shoulder and smoke damage to lungs. She had crawled into timber and hidden too injured to call out spending days, convinced both brother and son were dead. When she saw the baby alive and crying in Louisa's arms, her legs simply gave out. She collapsed to her knees in snow, and the sound she made was not quite sob, not quite scream, but something raw and primal from a place deeper than words. Ohiteka, barely conscious and swaying where Valentine had propped him against a tree, reached out one shaking hand toward his sister. Louisa handed the baby to Istas without hesitation, though the physical act of letting go felt like tearing away part of her own flesh. This was his mother, his family, where he belonged, and no amount of love or desperate protection could change that fundamental truth. The reunion was private and sacred, and Louisa turned away to give them space vision, blurring with tears she had not allowed herself during the tunnel or flight. Valentine put a hand on her shoulder, brief steadying, and she leaned into it gratefully. That night, huddled around a carefully shielded fire, while sentries watched approaches, Hewitt and Valentine studied Christian's ledger by flickering firelight. They understood that taking it to a territorial judge would result in its disappearance and possibly their deaths. But Christian's meticulous notes named not only Rusk, but Eastern investors from St. Louis and Chicago, and an Army lieutenant colonel who had signed falsified reports. Men in those positions feared public scandal far more than they feared frontier lives. "We send copies east," Hewitt said quietly, weathered face grim. "Not to territorial authorities they're bought. We send them directly to the investors who bankrolled Rusk and to their competitors. Let them know if anything happens to us or these people, every newspaper from St. Louis to New York gets full accounting." Valentine nodded slowly, then added a condition. "Any settlement includes money and legal title transfer. Small strip along the river, maybe 100 yards frontage, legally recorded in Mrs. Hartman's name as Christian's widow. No one back east will care about narrow, flood-prone parcel on the edge of nowhere. But for the Lakota, it's safe place to make winter camp and water horses. Unofficial, unacknowledged by treaty, but defended by legal paper." Louisa watched Ohiteka across the fire as Valentine worked on splinting his leg with willow branches and rawhide. He sat with sister beside him, one arm around her shoulders, baby sleeping peacefully in Istas's lap. He laughed once at something Istas said, low, genuine sound of relief and joy. And Louisa realized with a physical jolt that until this moment she had never heard him laugh with real happiness. The sound was beautiful and heartbreaking at once. Watching him in firelight with his family, she realized she did not want this temporary alliance to end when spring came. Did not want to return to her empty house and solitary life, teaching other people's children and pretending this week never happened. She did not know what the alternative looked like, or whether it was even possible in a territory where law had no patience for mixed families. But she knew with certainty that something fundamental had changed during those days of shared danger and desperate trust. 3 weeks passed. A reply arrived by telegraph and courier-sealed envelope bearing embossed letterhead of a Wind River law firm. The letter was carefully worded, acknowledging no wrongdoing, but offering resolution of outstanding claims related to regrettable events near Owl Canyon. Rusk and Company was being dissolved. Blackwater Falls Mine would change hands. Enclosed was a deed transferring a narrow strip of riverfront property and the Hartman homestead remnants to Louisa in settlement. No mention of massacres or Army complicity. The price of this silence was that no official body would ever acknowledge what happened or who bore responsibility. The men who planned and profited would face no criminal charges, but their contracts were quietly terminated and their reputations permanently tarnished. It was not justice, not really. But it was survival and perhaps the seed of something better. Louisa and Hewitt burned most of Christian's ledger in her kitchen stove, page by page, watching evidence curl and blacken. But before the last sheet, Louisa slipped a single page free and hid it wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard in the rebuilt barn. The page bearing Christian's signature beside his note about protecting the child. She kept it not for revenge, but as insurance, and as reminder that some truths were too dangerous to forget entirely. On legal record filed at the courthouse, the baby became Henry Hartman. The official story was that Christian had fathered the child with an unnamed woman who died in a fever outbreak. Louisa signed adoption papers with steady hand, while gossip swirled about the schoolteacher's soft heart. The truth was more complex. Henry spent 3 days each week in the Lakota camp, along the river strip, sleeping in Istas's lodge, and learning his first language under his mother's teaching. He spent 4 days in Louisa's rebuilt house, attending the schoolhouse, where Louisa taught him letters alongside miners' and farmers' children. Ohiteka moved between both worlds, his leg healed enough to walk, with only slight limp and a cane Valentine made. No one in Bitter Creek knew quite what to make of the arrangement. Some whispered it was improper for a respectable widow to keep company with a Lakota man. Others muttered the schoolhouse was no place for a half-breed child. But Valentine's support and Hewitt's official disinterest created protective space where gossip remained just talk. Summer came gradually, snow melting into mud, then into first green shoots. Wind River ran high with snow melt, and Lakota lodges remained along the protected strip, sheltered by Louisa's deed and Hewitt's enforcement. The mine changed hands, new management keeping distance from anything related to Lakota land. Valentine's practice grew as word spread. He treated everyone equally. The schoolhouse added a second row of benches for children from both town and camps. Istas wove a blanket with her distinctive star pattern, 5 points each, with 3 small stars inside, and hung it above the schoolhouse door, quiet declaration of whose child Henry was, and who would protect him. Muddy Boots built new steps and repaired the roof. Hewitt walked by more often than required, never asking about horses tethered in cottonwoods or Lakota voices drifting from Louisa's homestead. One evening, in late June, when air had lost its bitter edge and sun lingered longer above western horizon, Louisa stood on the low ridge above Wind River, watching light fade. Below, Henry played with children from both town and camp, his laughter ringing clear and unself-conscious. The sound made her smile, despite lingering ache of exhaustion and remembered fear. Ohiteka came to stand beside her, moving quietly enough she did not hear his approach until he was there. He leaned slightly on his carved cane and looked out over water in comfortable silence before speaking. "You could have left me in that tunnel, in darkness when the roof was falling. No one would have blamed you for choosing the child and your life." "I thought about it," Louisa answered with the same careful honesty they had learned to use with each other. "For 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then I realized I did not want to live in a world where I had made that choice. So I made a different one, and I haven't regretted it." He turned to look at her, studying her profile. "Why?" She considered the question carefully. "Because you were not a stranger anymore. You were someone who had come back through gunfire to keep me from falling into darkness. I could not abandon someone who had done that for me. It would have made me into someone I couldn't recognize." Something in his expression softened some wariness, easing from around his eyes. He shifted weight, moving half a step closer, so their shoulders nearly touched as they stood looking out over the shared land that was not truly safe, but safer than before. There was no kiss, no dramatic declaration. The frontier did not allow grand gestures, and both had learned that survival required patience and deliberate choices rather than reckless passion. But when Henry stumbled on a loose stone and began sliding toward the riverbank with a yelp They moved at the same instant, Louisa starting down the slope from one side, Ohiteka from the other hands, reaching out and voices calling the boy's name in two different languages. That meant exactly the same thing. You are ours. We will not let you fall. Istas looked up from the fire and smiled, slow, knowing expression, speaking of healing and acceptance. Valentine, checking a girl's scraped knee, glanced over and nodded once, before turning back to his patient. Hewitt, standing near camp edge with hat pushed back and badge catching last light, turned away to give them privacy, but did not leave. Sun dipped below the canyon rim, painting sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. Henry laughed as Louisa and Ohiteka reached him at the same moment, each catching one small hand. They lifted him gently between them, swinging him back up the slope with feet dangling. And for one heartbeat, the three were silhouetted against fading light, family forged not by blood or legal papers, but by simple, stubborn refusal to let go when the world tried to tear them apart. In the rebuilt barn at Bitter Creek's edge, under a loose floorboard where shadows gathered thick, a single page from Christian's ledger lay wrapped in oilcloth. It would remain their reminder that some truths were too dangerous to forget, but too painful to revisit. The rest of the world might never know what happened at Owl Canyon or in the collapsed tunnel, but the people who mattered knew. They had made their impossible choices and paid their terrible costs, and now they were learning to live with both. Summer deepened into long golden days. Lakota lodges remained along the river strip, protected by Louisa's deed and Hewitt's fair enforcement. The mine operated under new management that avoided trouble. Valentine's practice continued growing. The schoolhouse flourished with children from both communities learning together. Henry grew tall and quick feet, equally sure on schoolhouse floors and game trails. He learned to read English from Louisa's instruction and to track deer from Ohiteka's teaching. He learned to set bones from watching Valentine and to weave baskets from Istas's hands. He was neither fully white nor fully Lakota, but something new, a bridge between worlds at war-proof, that survival and love and family could grow even in the hardest ground. Years would pass. Henry would grow to adulthood strong and capable, comfortable in both worlds, yet never quite completely belonging to either. When old enough to ask hard questions, Louisa would take him to the barn and show him the hidden page and tell him everything about Christian and the ledger and the night in the mine when his mother and uncle and Valentine and she all refused to let him fall. She would explain that the world was not fair, that people made terrible choices, and that sometimes the only thing anyone could do was refuse to pass those choices to the next generation. But that conversation lay in the future. For now, on this summer evening, with light fading and river singing its eternal song, Louisa stood beside Ohiteka on the ridge and felt something settle deep in her chest. Peace she had not known since before Christian's death, or perhaps had never truly known at all. "Stay," she said quietly, not looking at him, but speaking to the evening air and the river below. Not just for Henry, not just because it's practical. Stay because you choose to. Stay because you want to build something neither of us could build alone. Stay because this has become home. Ohiteka remained silent for a long moment, weathered face, thoughtful in fading light. Then he reached out slowly and deliberately and took her hand, fingers warm and steady against hers. The gesture was simple, chaste, appropriate for the space they occupied and the eyes that might be watching. But the meaning was unmistakable. "I will stay," he answered in his careful English. "As long as you will have me, I will stay. For Henry, because he needs family and both his worlds. For you, because you came back into darkness for me when you could have chosen safety. And for the life we can build together if we are patient and wise and careful one day at a time, until we have built something strong enough to weather whatever storms may come." It was not poetry, not the grand declaration from novels Louisa had read as a girl, but it was honest and real and rooted in trust that could only be built through shared danger and deliberate choice. And that made it worth more than any number of pretty words. Below them, Henry's laughter rang out again, the sound rising like a promise kept. Istas began singing softly in Lakota lullaby or prayer melody carrying on warm breeze. Valentine packed his bag and prepared to ride back, but paused first to clasp Ohiteka's free hand in both his own. Hewitt tipped his hat to Louisa, silent acknowledgement that he would continue looking away at the right moments. Stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky overhead, cold and bright and impossibly distant. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling upward like tiny stars ascending to join their larger cousins. And on the ridge above the singing river, two people who had survived blizzards and bullets and collapsing tunnels stood hand in hand, watching the world they had fought to preserve settle into peaceful evening, and allowed themselves to believe they had earned the right to hope. The future stretched uncertain and unwritten. The past lay behind, like weight they would carry, always buried under stone, but marked in memory and that single hidden page. But the present, this moment with Henry's laughter and the river's song and the warmth of joined hands and first stars emerging, the present was enough. Just as the blizzard that had brought them together had finally broken and given way to clear skies, just as the snow that had nearly killed them was now melting into the river that gave life to this land, just as winter had surrendered at last to summer's warmth, so too had their separate sorrows begun to thaw and merge into something that resembled, if not quite happiness, then at least the possibility of it. The world had tried to bury them under its cruelties, but they had clawed their way back to light and air in each other, and in doing so had discovered that survival, when shared, could transform into something very much like grace. It was more than enough. It was everything that mattered.